I don't have the mental agility of Margaret, so we're going to take one question at a time, I'm afraid. So let's start with the gentleman there. Have we got some microphones in the wings?
Thank you. This is a question or a request for an opinion from Sarah and Chris. I can't remember which day of the week it is where the toast is our wives and sweethearts, may they never meet. I can't remember. Anyway, but bear that in mind just for a second. What's your opinion on Commander West? Sarah West, I think it was, who was the commanding officer of HMS Portland, who was dismissed from her vessel for having an affair with another officer. She's single, as I understand it, but from my time in the Royal Navy, I recall senior officers that would have affairs, dalliances between ranks. Do you uphold that decision by the Royal Navy? Do you condemn it, or do you think the rules should be changed?
I think interesting question. Thank you. In 2000, the Armed Forces brought in their Armed Forces Code of Social Conduct, which quite clearly covers behaviours that are appropriate and inappropriate, and the effect that can have on the operational effectiveness of a unit, and particularly those who are in command. So I think if you have a look at those values, where potentially that can, if somebody in command behaves inappropriately, can they retain that command? I think they just applied the policy. If that policy is applied fairly in all cases, from senior officers down to juniors, then well, that's what I'd hope will happen.
Good staff answer there, Chris. Thank you. From personal experience, I think it was not a question of morals. Certainly, it was a question of the command element of it. And commanding officers just, would put her in an invidious position. It doesn't matter that she was female or male, frankly. Well, it may well be. I had 16 females and 100 and something males in my ship. And, of course, there were relationships. There was a leading hand and a petty officer. She was a petty officer. He was a leading hand. And they came to see me before we sailed and said, one of us has got to get off, sir. I said, why? I said, I don't care about the relationship. Just don't do it in my ship. And actually, the crew knew all about it. They were very happy with it. They were invited to each other's messes. They behaved entirely appropriately. Went ashore together in Buenos Aires and whatever, and got happily married when the cruise was over. It's just a question of how it's handled. It's stupid to say it won't happen. Of course it'll happen. But I think in that particular case, it was the command aspect that was the deciding factor. Gentleman at the back.
To Chris or Sarah, there are a few groups that openly talk about the LGBT community at sea. Perhaps Worcester is an exception. How will you manage to move this debate on from a niche concern within an industry which is notoriously conservative and possibly even reactionary? And if I may, to Neil, what percentage of people with post-trauma stress tip over into post-trauma distress, or is that not a clinical reality? Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. Feeling targeted here. It's two in a row. I think the vehicle for raising the concern of LGBT community at sea has really been human rights at sea. That's really kick-started it, and I think today and what's happened so far with HRAS is really the start of the debate. But human rights at sea, I think, are the kind of the organisation that are interested and be the one to take that forward across the sector, bringing in well, perhaps like David has, speaking to myself and Sarah and some of our colleagues as to what we've learned from our experiences at sea and in the Navy, and using that in the wider context.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
There we go. Also, is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I'd also bit of a devil's advocate here, but you referred to LGBT issues as a niche issue. So I'd throw that question back to you and ask, why do you think it's a niche issue? Because I'd say it isn't, because LGBT people are everywhere and always have been. So to perceive it as niche is possibly part of the problem.
It's precisely because it's not an open debate as yet. I should say it can be as niche as you.
Yeah, sorry, Ken, I didn't recognise you right there in the glue.
And And in terms of trauma, that graph I put up basically shows, and that's a reasonable graph after a single incident, that probably in most cases over half the people who go through a really serious incident will have some symptoms, but in most cases those symptoms will dissipate over the first 4, 6, 8 weeks. The final percentage that end up with a disorder like PTSD is really difficult to say. So we know, for instance, in the cases of rape, about 50% of people who suffer rape will go on and have a long-term disorder. And if you look at, say, road traffic accidents, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15%. But of course, rapes and road traffic accidents aren't all exactly the same. And so it really does depend on the actual incident.
Any more have excited your interest out there? I'm going to ask Martin, because he's sitting there very, very quietly here. Why do you think it's very much a Christian thing, this provision of seafarers' welfare? I don't know if similar organisations to yours within other faiths, or perhaps there are.
Yeah, clearly, Christians don't have a monopoly on compassion. And at times, we have acted in ways that are not compassionate. I think we have to recognise that. I think certainly within the maritime sector, as far as I'm aware, there are no welfare providers from other faiths. The sector is dominated by Christian welfare organisations. I think that's fundamentally because we believe our Christian faith calls us to serve seafarers as human beings, as has been alluded to by a number of speakers today. Yeah, I hope that addresses your question.
Thank you. Yeah. Got a series of primed questions here, which David gave me, so I'm not being very clever here. Yes, sir.
Llewellyn Banks Hughes from Petrospot. It's a question which may or not be appropriate to this particular session, or maybe the next one, but it's on my mind, and it's for Norman. And you have these big ships, tankers, etc., trawling through the Mediterranean, stopping to pick up migrants, and you said 183 on one occasion on 2 rafts. Is there any feeling at all that you're picking up 183 people, you've got 14 crew, or 18 crew, according to Cuba, that there are a chunk of people in those rafts who are not there for good reasons, and they may come over onto the ship, be rescued, overpower the crew, and run off with the ship and do something nasty with it? Is this a consideration of not stopping?
Actually, it's a consideration, but to be frank, of course we have procedures and we have plans in place how to deal with such kind of operations. So when I basically say that we are rescuing, or one of our ships or of our competitors is rescuing migrants, you can be sure that there are certain procedures in place which will make sure that especially what you are saying is not happening. And of course, sometimes procedures are not catering with the scope of the work. I mean, we don't have any plan to rescue 200 or 300 or 400 people with 15 people, but at least what we can do is we can separate them. We can only allow one each time coming on board, doing a proper screen. I mean, people actually had to undress themselves to make sure that they're not carrying knives, weapons, or whatever. And this has, of course, all been done in an appropriate way. So, male, female is basically been separated. Of course, there's an issue with if you have only males on board, how can you check a female? This is an issue, but yes, we have plans, and I think the industry has plans for that. And at least I don't know any company who basically would see the security concern as such, not at least to provide support to a vessel in distress.
We'll keep our fingers crossed, I think. Yes.
Alex Foster-Androust from Greenpeace. My question is for Martin. I was interested to hear you say at the very start that you believe the best way to reach people and support them is to actually go out to where they are on board vessels rather than just having initiatives in ports. I know that there are obviously other places where there are initiatives in ports, and I was wondering what you think about those. And one specific thing I'm thinking about was with Thai Union, a large seafood company, and they claim that they're doing a very good job regarding human rights because they have posters up in their factories saying you can call a helpline, something which personally I don't feel is enough. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that or any views on different types of initiatives from what you mentioned as best practice.
Yes, certainly my Apostleship of the Sea colleagues in Thailand have worked with NGOs and law enforcement in tackling abuse in the fishing sector. But as I alluded to in my presentation, we are not trades unions. We're not port state control. And when we're invited to join those types of operations, we are there to offer pastoral support and practical support to the crew, because that's where our expertise lies. I think, staying ashore in seafarer centres and expecting seafarers to come to us is complacent, and so many seafarers simply do not have the time to leave their ship and to come to a seafarer centre. So it's imperative that we do go to them, because it's through engaging with seafarers that you build those relationships that then enable them to trust you and to blow the whistle when there are instances of abuse or ill treatment. Okay.
Yeah, it's very much down to the operating pattern of the ships evolving now, isn't it?
Can I just say a point? Just on your other point about the telephone helpline, so to speak, many organisations across the world, particularly the developed part of the world, have employee assistance programs which provide exactly this sort of intervention. There's very little evidence that they make a difference. In most organisations, they get take-up rates of between 6 and 8%. And most of the problems that go to EAPs aren't related to the job at all. They're related to other stuff that goes on. So I would be equally as suspicious as you are that probably merely putting a helpline number up is not a particularly helpful thing to do.
There are, of course, some very good professional advice lines available based in this country, a couple of them supporting seafarers, and SAIL, Seafarers Advice and Information Line, and they get really a very heavy take-up of professional employee-type questions from seafarers, like thousands a year. So those lines do exist, and I think are pretty well advertised. Yes.
Hello, Alison Godfrey from the Fisherman's Mission. Just to sort of follow on with that, we are an organisation who work very closely with Martin and Barry, and we often meet very traumatised fishermen who've just been sort of yanked out of the sea, and they're brought to us straight away, or perhaps have witnessed fatal or very life-changing incidents. Is there any evidence that any immediate input of some kind at the very first point after the trauma would make any difference to how they continued to deal with the incident or not?
So in terms of pastoral care, being decent to people, looking after their practical needs in terms of, clothing and shelter and food, all that stuff is really important. But in terms of starting to do some sort of psychological intervention and getting them to tell you about how terrible it was and how they're feeling, absolutely no evidence that works. And in fact, the evidence, as I alluded to, actually is that it could make people worse. So all the debriefing stuff isn't just it's a waste of time. It's actually the people who are left alone do better than the people who get this psychological intervention. But being a decent human being, listening and caring and taking account of what they're saying, absolutely fine. And if that's done by you, that's great. And actually, if it's done by their colleagues and their line managers, and when the time's appropriate, their families, even better. But just don't start getting psychotherapist.
Yes, lady two back there.
Hi, I just wanted to repeat my question of earlier.
Yes, please do.
So this is Alex at Veris Maplecroft, and my question was, in the ship industry, if we're talking about seafarers, who is actually accountable for enforcing human rights on a ship? So if I'm a company and I want to guarantee that the products that I bring in on a ship that I sell in my supermarket or my shop, that they have been transported by seafarers who've been treated decently, who do I go to ask? Because I understand it's quite complex, so there's a ship manager, a ship captain, a ship owner, various chartering and contracting agencies. So who is responsible?
Norman, can you take that one?
It's a good question. In general, if you, let's say we take the example, you want to ship a container from somewhere in China, Wuhan, to Felixstowe. So I can assure you that the ocean leg is perhaps the most regulated one when it comes to your question. There are first of all a couple of regulations, conventions in place. One of them, of the most noteworthy, is the Maritime Labour Convention, which basically makes sure that those working on board ships actually are being treated in accordance with the rules and regulations, and also that they are treated actually correctly when it comes to allowing them to find their jobs. So the old days where seafarers had to pay to get their jobs, basically, luckily, I wouldn't say they are over because of the MLC, but simply they are over because if you're qualified, the market looks very, very favorable for seafarers, because as we all know, there's a shortage. So if you are qualified, if you want to do a job, you can find a good job in any country. However, the MLC gives the possibility for various enforcement agencies to make sure that actually the standards are being complied with. And this is then again the responsibility of the flag state, and as well as the port state in which the vessel will basically start to sail and go from, let's say, from Shanghai to Felixstowe. If I look at our ships, which would be doing this route, I can tell you that on an annual basis they would be visited by port state control inspectors, by an perhaps MSC inspector, perhaps by an ITF inspector 2 or 3 times per year. So that means this is the ocean leg is actually looked after quite well. And in the end, on the daily responsibilities, of course, with the master, because he is the one who has to make sure that people are being properly rested, that they can do their work, that they have all the tools, and whatever they need, this is basically being communicated towards the company, and that the company in the end is also supplying it. So ultimately, you would be looking most likely at your shipping company, which you are choosing, your logistic provider, and you would ask them to make sure that all standards are complied with. And I would invite you to basically do audits and inspections by yourself, because companies are actually doing that, to verify that whatever has been said is actually also adhered to.
Thank you. Cuba, did you want to add something to that?
I think we are all waiting for the magic word. The magic word is DOC, Document of Compliance. So there is only one entity which holds this document. In the whole chain, there is only one. Colombia is DOC holder. So that's the passport for the vessel. These are the guys responsible for the ship. So if you are really after anybody, go for DOC, Document of Compliance. Okay, ask this magic question, are you a DOC holder? And if they say no, don't talk to them. Don't go to those who are DOC holder. They are ultimately responsible for the ship. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
But Kuba, perhaps she wouldn't find us. This is also something what we have to say. What Kuba says is absolutely correct, the DOC holder. But as a shipper, I think most companies who are shipping goods from A to B are not familiar with this term.
Okay, Mission Control, I'm afraid, says it's coffee or questions, and he's gone for the coffee. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you in half an hour's time.